Hey, Jeannie,
Yeah, Brew.
I'm excited that Penn Loh is on the show today.
So am I. Good morning, Penn.
Good morning, Bruce. Good morning, Jeannie.
It's really good to see you. I know you've been super, super busy, and I've just reread your article about Pluriverse, and I have so many questions. But what were you thinking of talking about this morning?
We could start with the future or where we are now or back in the Reagan years or that would,
Yeah.
wherever you like.
Maybe I will start with just a little recount of my own journey in terms of getting to a concept like the pluriverse, which of course I didn't make up, but I've run into and makes a lot of sense to me. But I'll go back to when I first met Bruce. I was coming out of school in college at MIT, trained to solve technical problems, basically, right? And calculate things to help do that. And the reason I ended up working for Bruce at the TELUS Institute was really troubled by what engineers were being asked to do at that time. This was still in the heart of a military industrial complex and buildup that Reagan had started. And I was literally running away from positions that were about, I had a summer internship designing missile guidance systems. And realizing that was not bringing good things to life, which is what the GE commercials used to say. And, so found the TELUS Institute, this shop that was working on energy and environmental stuff, and, found that I could apply some of my technical skills there. And, it was really solid, important work.
Promoting energy efficiency and working in the public interest and
Exactly.
making change a little increment at a time.
Exactly. And then I think that was really for me, the increment at a time was, I think I didn't appreciate so much when I was young. I was looking for more drastic change, and there was more politics, I think, involved in the change. That wasn't going to necessarily pay my bills, but, so I was delighted to be able to find a job that was about trying to move that type of incremental change. But I ended up going back to grad school and discovered the environmental justice movement. And for me, that was something that really pulled together my commitment and passion for social justice, racial economic justice with environment, which I actually had not made that connection, not even, in maybe a tangential way at TELUS. It was not so direct for me. So after I left TELUS, I went out to grad school at UC Berkeley and ran into folks who were just kind of getting involved in the emerging environmental justice movement nationwide. And that was a revelation that kind of these social justice issues were directly connected to environment. Environment wasn't about just kind of what's happening to humanity as a whole planet, but that, it had differential impacts, disproportionate burdens on lower income communities and communities of color, and that these communities needed to be leading the way. And so, I was fortunate enough to do a lot of work helping to support grassroots and community level environmental justice work. And that was also very fulfilling. Did that for about 13 years and did that here in Boston with a group called ACE, Alternatives for Community and Environment, which is still around. And that was really also, I felt like, it was getting towards what I was looking for and hoping for and what I thought were some of the levers of change. In my first few years at ACE, we were doing work with youth, we were doing work with a number of community groups. They were all worried about public health impacts of air pollution. Asthma was a really big issue. It was being kind of discovered as an epidemic in urban communities of color. And we knew that it was tied to environmental conditions, both, of course, outdoors and indoors. But, just making that connection was really profound. The young people we worked with were asking, what's going on? What is it about our neighborhood that's making it so that, basically everybody in my class either has asthma or has a close family member with asthma?
Where are these fine particulates coming from?
Yeah, exactly. Fine particulate. So we did a lot of, in just the space of a few years, there's growing momentum built, organizing work that community groups were doing. And we knew that diesel pollution was one of the dirtiest sources of the fine particulates, as well as all kinds of other nasty toxics. And we were part of helping to start the Clean Buses for Boston Coalition that was trying to get, at the very least, we can get our public transit system to change over from dirty diesel fuels to cleaner alternatives. And that's one of the things that, we're most proud of is we were able to help move the MBTA to switch all of their 1,000 bus fleet from dirty diesel to cleaner alternatives, which included compressed natural gas at the time.
That's not tiny incremental change. That's significant increments, right?
And that's what gave me hope, So I guess, Bruce, you're pointing to, the things that we felt like, hey, if we can do this, what's the next thing? And lo and behold, within another couple of years, we were able to get the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to put forth its first environmental justice policy through the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. And our own story that we were telling ourselves was that, we can scale up change. It starts at the grassroots. It starts with empowerment of the communities most affected. And if these communities can essentially be at the table and ensure that they're not getting further dumped on, but actually can promulgate solutions that actually can improve conditions for everybody, then we're going to get to environmental justice. So that was the hope. Fast forward a number of years, and towards the end of my time at ACE, this is maybe towards like 2007, 8. We were seeing, I guess, that, just having stayed in the work long enough, and I knew a lot of veterans, people who had been doing this type of community work for decades and decades, and they say there's always ups and then there's downs, and then there's ups and downs, and hopefully you're taking one step forward and not taking two steps back. But we couldn't help but get a little discouraged because it did feel like at times we were taking one step forward and two steps back. So
at best, it's a long arc. And then
it is
slow, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's not always so clear, what the theory of change is and what are you putting your faith in, right, in terms of what that arc might look like. And certainly I don't think anyone was giving up, but I think there is that question of like, not to say that we were saying it's impossible, but like, how do we make it more possible, at least during our lifetimes, to bend that arc as much as we can. Just to give you an example, we did win the bus fleet conversion, and that was a great victory. But then the T started raising fares. And we realized that, the whole system was going to become unaffordable, especially for the folks that needed it the most. And that was a bigger kind of fiscal structural issue having to do with public funding of transit. We, at that time, were very, very far away from the conversations that actually are now happening today about, can we make all the buses free? We used to laugh off, that as an idea. This was the advocates and the organizers saying, yeah, that's impossible. We're never going to get that. And then here we are, 15 years later, 20 years later, and the politics have changed. People are talking about free transit. But to go back to kind of a period where we started to get a little discouraged, or where I got a little discouraged, I think it was the recognition that we were trying to operate and do all this work, build power to try to shift the system and shift policy, but yet we were embedded in kind of a broader economic system that was really driving the politics and driving unsustainabilities and driving inequalities.
You're trying to fix capitalism with capitalism, or markets with markets.
Yeah. So Bruce, I think a lot of us in this work, individually, personally, had our own critiques of capitalism, had our own ideas about revolution, but we were not part of any institutions that had that as their kind of grounding theory. At least that wasn't the case at ACE. We were not kind of ideological in that way. We were committed to the grassroots, to community empowerment, whatever the community is wanting to do. But it became increasingly evident to us that we were pushing up against the limits of what capitalist kind of economic practices, capitalist, approaches in government, what a lot of people call the kind of neoliberalization, and trying to privatize everything and deregulate things and try and create a better business climate. And the idea that free markets are the answer to everything, right? For us, these were leading us the wrong way. And we needed to engage in a broader, deeper politics that engaged some of these ideologies. And also, I think what we were realizing was we did not have our own proactive vision of what the world should be like. A lot of us did not really believe or sign up for the way that revolution may have been portrayed as happening in the 20th century, right? Communism versus capitalism, and one's going to win over the other. And we saw that that was fraught. There had to be another way. And so for me, that coincided with me coming to Tufts to teach full-time, opening up a lot of space to do some deeper reflection and exploration, and doing that with community partners, with grad students here at Tufts. And we ran right into a whole bunch of folks who were searching for the same things. And what started out here being called new economy, we started to see that in other parts of the world, people were talking about solidarity economies, social economies, and that these were connected to progressive social movements, that these were about not just economic justice, but also, broadly speaking, sustainability, in addressing kind of humanity's relationship to all the life systems that support us on this earth. And that, we needed a drastic shift in, how we live, and not just how we, produce and consume and exchange things kind of in a strict economic sense, but that was tied to a whole shift in thinking about and our approach to how we relate to each other and to all the different systems that we're a part of that we can never separate from. The solidarity economies became and continues to be a big, big area of inspiration. I've been working with something called the Solidarity Economy Initiative for the last 6-7 years. This is a program of the Center for Economic Democracy, where I'm on the board and helped to get that going. This was an organization that was really founded to help grassroots organizing entities really develop, their own perspective on what is the broader change that we want to see. And then how can we continue to build towards that from the local level. So the Solidarity Economy Initiative has 11 grassroots organizations, mostly here in the Boston area. And we've done a lot of our own education, leadership development, strategy, and visioning. It's been a great experience to see how, folks in those organizations that, I can empathize with because I was in that same position, feeling like this is a bit skeptical. Like, oh yeah, people tried co-ops before. There's a lot of folks from the 70s who were doing co-ops, but aren't they so small and marginal, right? Isn't it just a bike shop here and a bookshop there and a cafe maybe?
Great, but it doesn't scale.
How's that going to change capitalism, right?
I mean, it must have felt great in a way to meet people with all the other worldviews and to see people doing something that was organized in a way that was different than what you had been doing. Well, my question is, at the same time, did it feel like a rejection of what you had been working on? And I feel like so many are still catching up to the models that you and ACE were building in the 90s. So I'm curious about the feelings of kind of merging the past with the sort of new paradigm.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeannie. I guess the way I'll answer that is that, I think for a lot of us, I'll speak for myself, but I know I've had these kinds of conversations with lots of the folks who are in similar roles in similar kind of base building organizations that really see themselves as part of social justice movements, more broadly speaking, and working towards transformation, which is that, we're always trying to keep it real. We are trying to figure out, like, if we're going to go after incremental change, what does that do for us besides just the increment? Are we doing this because it sets us up, for the next step? And do we have a sense of what that trajectory can look like? Does this step help, build more desire and consciousness amongst, folks in our communities and in the broader public, right, to pursue deeper change, right? Because what we saw was there were so many times we were going after change, and then the politics, the real politic when you get to the state house or whatever, forces you into, maybe trading away kind of the reason why you did the campaign in the first place just in order to get a win.
And then if you win, there's the backlash.
Yeah, exactly. So, going back to the example of the MBTA, we fought long and hard and we said, we are just going to fight against the fare increase. And we knew we weren't going to win that. But when we fought with that as our battle cry, people understood that. In the organizing. People who were transit riders were like, yeah, hell no, we're not going to pay more, especially if you're not going to improve service or, treat us better. So then the second time around that we had to fight the battles just a few years later, we went in and, some of the strategists were saying we can't go and to have the demand to be no fare increase, but then what we said, well, what are we going to do? A battle cry of like, let's have less of a fare increase. That's not very inspiring to anybody to get involved in the fight. We were saying, like, it's all in how you fight, and you may still get to an incremental change or to something that feels like just a mitigation of something that should have never happened in the first place. But what's that bigger vision that you're working towards? Like, we didn't have a free transit kind of idea that was out there that says, what we said at that time was bus riders, particularly transit dependent folks, deserved first class affordable service. And that resonated with folks. But then, how do you make it happen? And, there's a lot of other stuff involved in that. But Jean, I guess to go back to your question, for us, keeping it real means that we're trying not to delude ourselves about how much progress we're actually making. In public, we may say, yes, great, we're showing we have power. We've managed to stop the fare increase to only 10% instead of 20%. And, we'll puff ourselves, but we try not to get caught up in our own hype, right? And what we do is say, what do we really need to do if we keep our eyes on the prize? And that's why, I think I really welcome the fact that, so the environmental justice policy I told you about that we were fighting for got implemented through the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. We made many, many attempts to get that encoded into law at the state level and failed in repeated attempts, from the early 2000s. It took until last year for that to happen. People who were involved in that were fighting the good fight throughout and, sensed the political opening, and we said, let's do it. And people did it, and rightly so celebrated. But we knew that, even if we had gotten the policy that we got, we wouldn't have environmental justice tomorrow, right? It just becomes another tool in the fight. And the question is like, what's that bigger fight? How are we working with folks to understand that? And I guess for me, this gets the pluriverse. Maybe this is the thing we can kind of move to in this final part of the interview. So pluriverse, the whole idea is something that, even 5 years ago, I would have told you like, what are you talking about? This sounds like sci-fi or ultra philosophical kind of intellectualizing.
It sounds like Penn Loh has been doing really good work for decades, and it's amazing. And then he went to Burning Man, and now he's came back talking about multiverses, and he's going to be completely effective.
I know. Well, if Spider-Man can have a multiverse, right? We can have one too. But I think for me, I'll just describe one thing that came out of something that a friend of mine gave me to read about someone describing something called one world world, right? And it was this idea that, there's a kind of a Western modernist kind of rational way of thinking that says there's only one reality, right? There's kind of one blank template out there that we all share in this, single universe. It's a single reality, and then there's just lots of different ways that people exist on it, right? This is a very, very different view from, it's very easy to point to a lot of indigenous cosmologies, right? Where folks don't really see that. But this is the kind of view that, the person who wrote this article, John Law, started his article saying, in Australia, you had the colonial settlers who came in from Europe. And what they saw was a bunch of Aborigines out on the land, but they said, do they own the land? And according to the Western European standards was like, no, they don't own the land because they didn't do this and that and the other thing. So therefore it's free for whoever wants to occupy it, right? And similar mentality here in the US, of course, with settling across the Americas. So, but for the Aboriginals, their whole concept of the land was that it's not something you can actually own. Right? Ownership was not a concept. The land is something that they're a part of. The land is something that, that they make because, it's part of their life ways. And we may think of this as quaint or like, oh, this is worse, a primitive practice that's just not modern, right? And not caught up with, what modern world and science has us now believe. But these ways of thinking, this one world thinking, right, is really, I kind of feel like my whole educational life was set up to be trained to think this way, right? That's the only way we can do science and separating ourselves, right, from subject and object. Humans separating ourselves from the rest of the earth. When we think about societies or economics, individuals as existing before communities, right? And I think for me, pluriverse is really based on this idea of radical relationality. And it's this idea that nothing is real except in relationship, right? So, you can't be an individual without being in relationship to others, right? That's the only way you can be an individual. But yet we have this hyper-individualism, which is part of capitalist thinking, as well as other ways of thinking that, thinks that there's such a thing as being an individual. Right, fully formed, and Western, political philosophy is full of ponderings about what is the individual in a state of nature, whatever that is, right? So we've like invented these ideas. It's not real, but we act as if it is real, and then we act as if there's only one world. But if you take a real radical relational approach, then what happens is there are multiple realities that are possible, right? Because people make these realities by being in relationship to things, and to me, opens up possibility, right? So instead of thinking, for example, in our work around solidarity economies, that, we've got to scale up the co-ops, so that we can compete with Walmart, right? Because that's, that's what's happening in this single world. A solidarity economy kind of pluriversal approach would say, you know what? There are actually lots of different ways that people are doing economy now. And these practices exist. What we need to do is continue to spread these practices, spread the ideas, and the more people can live it and feel it, right, the more real it will become to them. So part of this goes back to like, we can all, think globally, act locally, right? One of the big tenets of the environmental movement. This is really that in a radical way, saying all of us can be change agents because we are all part of producing the realities that we're a part of. That doesn't mean we all have equal power. That doesn't mean that we can do it alone, but it means that, in all the spaces we are in our lives, whether that's in our families, in our workplaces, in, our neighborhoods, there are different ways we can relate to each other that start to produce different ways of being, right? That we don't have to fall into these hyper individualistic competitive behaviors that, are what you might have to do if you're trying to compete in today's, economic markets, or what you might have to do if you're in the real politic of, today's state house or Congress.
We're just maximizing utility and adding value here.
Yeah. So it's a conception that, we can be much more than that. We already are. One of the things that I point to with students, and some of whom come in to grad school because they're like, I want to learn the tools so we can figure out how to get the right policies in place so we can become, sustainable and socially just, right? All these great, noble ambitions. And I said, well, is that really a matter of calculation? Is that really a matter of, a technical problem, solving a technical problem? To what extent can those tools even help us in that, right? And my approach now would be to say that, it can in some circumstances, in some conditions, and we should be using those. And I'm so glad that we have an IPCC, that we have scientists across the world who are trying to, better understand what the, human impacts on the environment are and what might be ahead of us.
And engineers, we could use more engineers solving problems, right? Designing good.
Yeah, solving real problems, right? But that those are not divorced from, I would say, the very basic challenge of, how are we being with others?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that look like in our own direct relationships as well as indirect relationships through the institutions, the policies, and all these political and economic systems that we're a part of, right? So
thanks, Ben. That was really great. Do you want to say?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, there's so much there. It's really beautiful. And I feel like we need some new language. I like your language around relational relationship, because I feel like a lot of what you were talking about is human-centered versus the machine, which could be the institutions of schools. It could be
the robot apocalypse.
That's there too. But even just the government funding that we're all looking forward to in terms of, hey, we're centering justice, we're centering historically excluded communities. And then you've got these grassroots groups that you're familiar with in the Boston area, working with Climbable and Synapse to say, okay, let's fund these smaller grassroots groups. But we work at a pace that is not the normal business pace. We have constraints that don't meld well with these kind of requirements of these big government grants. And there's just a lot of mismatch. And I'm glad to hear you talking about kind of ways to focus on what's important. And it's not just nuance. I mean, there are some big chunky differences here. And so anyway, mostly just to say it's great to hear about this and that we have a lot of work to do.
We do. Yeah, I was just thinking maybe one thing it would be helpful for me to say is just that, one of the phrases that spoke a lot to me and that I use a lot is the Zapatista's phrase of, a world where many worlds fit, right? And for me, that really represents a pluriversal approach, right? It's saying that there are multiple possibilities, there are multiple realities. It's not all clean and tidy in terms of making a singular system, right? But that, in fact, we have multiple systems, multiple realities of people doing things in different ways. And how can we all coexist? And how can we not get stuck in this idea that there just has to be one way, right? And this is a big question in the solidarity economy space, where people are like, well, is solidarity economy a singular economy? And is it something that we get to replace capitalism as a singular, system? And I think more and more folks are saying, no, that's part of this one world thinking. One, everything is place-based. So everything that we do has to fit its context and the people and the place, right? And the ecosystems that are there. And so all these things that we call solidarity economy or other, similar terms, they don't all have to look the same, and they can't, because they're all being produced in different places. Of course, these places are all interconnected, right? So it's not to say we don't have connections beyond the local. Of course we do, but that doesn't mean that there's just like, this one machine that's going to look the same and operate the same all across, this earth.
One of the things I love about this conversation is it's helping me with the nerd show. So we've been making this energy nerd show now, like 60 something episodes, through the pandemic, and talking with all different kinds of people. And, there's conversation about, what's going on Chelsea Creek, and there's what's going on over the last 100 years in global energy and carbon emissions. And there's like technology things, ammonia as a energy carrier versus, and just all these different perspectives, and energy justice, and kind of all these pieces together, which are frankly often contradictory or kind of grinding against each, not necessarily in the episode, but if you kind of watch the whole thing, or you see these pieces that just kind of like don't fit together. And yet I've really enjoyed it. And I really love talking with the people and listening to these different ideas. But I've been feeling like, oh, Bruce, this is just intellectual laziness that you're not reconciling. You're not fitting these all together into a thing. But no, it's a interconnected, respectful, relational approach.
Yeah. I mean, how many folks, isn't kind of what you're talking about, this lure of trying to think that there's a possibility of a grand unified theory, right? Like the physicists have been going after forever and ever. Again, the lure is there, but being able to let go of that and step back from that and saying, there's lots of different ways that we exist and that we think, and there's not only one set of first principles that explains everything.
I haven't given up on a grand unified theory of physics and, particle physics and energy and astrophysics, and the idea that there's an objective physical reality in some sense that science ought to go after with its methods and all. But, like economics, Frank Ackerman explained to me many times about how, Samuelson started in thermodynamics, right? And the whole, all the models of equilibrium and how the agents interact is really from physics and thermodynamics. And one of the many mistakes we humans make with our simplified models is applying physics to things about humans. And humans are just so much more complicated. Our brains are obviously inadequate.
Yeah, and Bruce, we can't escape our humanness, right? Like our own abilities of perception and knowing, we're stuck with them. So I think, again, like these imaginings of what is a reality beyond our perception are just imaginings. And I think some of them can be very, very powerful in terms of, how we interact and, how we've essentially engineered, things. But I think for me, it's a little easier to swallow that we have these social realities, right? That are fundamentally like, can only be interpreted through our humanness.
And reality might be an overstatement of the word.
Yeah. I've moved a rung further. My own understanding of what reality is shifting because of some of these ideas. It's not just social reality. And it's not that there's a physical reality out there that's unknowable or beyond us, or that we can try to know through certain, scientific knowledge. But even our own scientific knowledge is a part of constructing reality or realities, so there's different versions of physics theories, right, that have different notions of what reality is. And
if you were going into a new coalition of people you were going to work with over the next 9 months or 18 months, and at the beginning of the meeting you're setting ground rules and everyone can say, step up, step back, make space, respect, and do you have a phrase for this thing that won't, have people saying, what are you taking or whatever?
That's a great question. But I would say that whole process of setting ground rules or group norms, to me, that is a very, very relational approach, right? It's not something, if you go into certain types of institutions, right? These are not something that are up for discussion, right? You go to the State House and you've got Robert's Rules of Orders on the floor, right? You go, at least, in my experience, you go into the classroom, right? And it's whatever, the instructor says it is. But I think this group norm thing opens up space. It asks the question like, do we want to be this way with each other? So just having that as a practice, to me, is a relational practice, is getting us in this direction of opening up more possibility. But if I were to add one, I do a lot of work still with folks at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, right? And this is a community organization that really took community control over development at a time when their neighborhood was being disinvested in back in the 80s. They now own over 30 acres through their own community land trust. One of their mantras throughout is that anything is possible. So basically you never say never, and you try not to quash people's dreams by saying that's not realistic. Say anything is possible. That doesn't mean anything's going to be easy or will be possible tomorrow. But it does say, we have to hold on to what we can imagine, because if we don't, we get stuck in this like very skeptical, cynical kind of way of being. I know for myself, I don't want to be there. And I think pluriversal ideas start to open that up and hopefully make it feel more real that these things are actually possible.
Awesome. This has been such a great conversation. You're an inspiration.
And like the arc of your career kind of tracks this arc of thinking about it in this really interesting way. I want a time machine to then interview Penn Loh 5 or 10 years from now. That I want to talk to that Penn Loh now and see what you're going to be talking about then and what you're thinking.
I'll be fascinated too to do that. So.
Awesome. It's really great to see you.
Yeah, good to see both of you, and thanks so much for this opportunity. It's been fun.
Yeah,
thanks.
For us too.
All right, take care.